Hello, you are listening to PIPA podcast, and this is the third season of our Art Conversation series. This time, we produced a special season to talk about art and psychoanalysis, in which we discussed with artists, psychoanalysts, and psychiatrists about this intersection. Our last episode of the season is with the curator of PIPA Institute, Luiz Camillo Osorio, and with Carles Guerra, a Catalan art critic, professor, and researcher who signed the curatorship of Francesc Tosquelles like a sewing machine in a wheat field that is open until August at the Center of Contemporary Art in Barcelona, Spain. The exhibition revisits Tosquelles' work, an important Catalan psychiatrist. He was the doctor of the Psychiatric Hospital of Saint-Alban in France and is known as one of the curators of institutional psychotherapy, an influential movement in mental health in the last century. So, hi Carles and Camilo. It is a pleasure to have you two for the podcast. We are finishing the season on arts and psychoanalysis, and it would be great to hear from you, Carles, about the exhibition that is open until August in Barcelona. Tosquelles like a sewing machine in a wheat field, the translation, about Tosquelles, this very important psychiatrist in Spain and France. As the curator of the exhibition and writer of the book La Déconiatrie, could you tell us the role of Tosquelles in mental health in Europe and why his work is so important until these days?
Well, Tosquelles, it is important indeed, but it's not so well known. I mean, except in France, where he had a professional career, starting in 1940 when he left the concentration camp in France, where he ended up after the Spanish Civil War. So in France, in between 1940 and 1962, he worked at the Saint-Alban Hospital in the middle of France, in a very impoverished area. But there he conducted one of the most advanced experiences in psychiatry by leading what we have come to know as the institutional psychotherapy. And the institutional psychotherapy was a movement promoted by not only doctors, but also by the people living around the hospital. And the relevance of Tosquelles, it's not just as someone who came up with a theory, because he was basically a pragmatic personality, but as someone who led all these transformations within the hospital, within the framework of institutional psychotherapy. And basically, he proposed a different relationship with madness since early his childhood, where when he was born in Reus, in a small village in Catalonia. And in that village, it happened to be one of the most important psychiatric hospitals built in the 19th century. So he was often a visitor of that hospital, and he recalled all his life experiences by which he came to understand what should be the relationship to madness. And then Tosquelles is someone who's always been restructuring the relationship between madness and the so-called normality. That's why, for example, in 1932, he was one of the first introductors of Lacan's thesis on paranoia.
Commenting this that you were saying about the psychotherapy, institutional psychotherapy, he's one of the creators of this method. And what effects do we see until these days in mental health institutions that come from this method?
Institutional psychotherapy basically promoted the idea that what was to be healed was not the patient, but the institution itself. So the diagnosis of Tosquelles is that the institution provokes a certain chronic, it makes the patient a chronic patient, someone who will be ill because the institution itself reinforces methods that keeps this person who has been segregated from society and from economy and from normal social relationships. It is an institution that its main objective becomes to keep this person segregated, to keep this person away from the contact of the rest of society. So what Tosquelles promoted was the idea that the hospital should be a place to make madness livable, to make madness something that could be decently experienced within the premises of the institution. That's why he never meant to close, destroy, or kind of deny the institution like the anti-psychiatry movement did. And that's again one of the reasons why institutional psychotherapy by the end of the 60s, early 70s, was brutally confronted with anti-psychiatry, and the anti-psychiatry movement was more kind of in tune with radical movements. And this is also what contributed to the vanishing, to the sort of kind of disappearance of Tosquelles' heritage. So in short, institutional psychotherapy promoted the possibility that madness, or as we say nowadays, neurodiversity, could be healed within an environment in which the relationship between doctors and patients was not the only one, but the relationships were rather kind of multifaceted in between what in French they call the personnel soignant, the caretakers, or even the villagers that lived around the hospital, as it was the case in Saint-Alban throughout the 40s and the 50s, a small hospital surrounded by the economies of farmers and peasants, something that in fact it was what saved the hospital in the early 40s. As I said before, Tosquelles arrived there because he left the concentration camp after the invitation of Paul Balvet, the director at the time. But when Tosquelles arrived in 1940 in Saint-Alban, in France, it is taking place what is being called the l'extermination douce, the soft extermination, a process by which more than 40,000 patients were or kind of starved, died out of starvation. That is to say, whereas in Germany, the Nazis promoted the Action T4 program, by which any mentally ill person with a chronic diagnosis was sent to an extermination camp. In France, they didn't have such a program. On the contrary, what they had was a very perverse measure by which they were undernourishing the people, the interns, the inmates in hospitals. What happened was that, first they were dying out of hunger, out of cold, and it was kind of an indirect program to kill, to exterminate mentally ill people.
The catalog, I was really impressed with how Saint-Alban, this psychiatrist hospital that Tosquelles was working on, was a place where many artists were working in, and they, in a way, were received in the hospital as a place where they could be saved from Vichy and from the Nazi persecution, because they were either Jew or socialist or communist or whatever. And so it's interesting how the hospital could absorb the avant-garde artists, especially the surrealists, and how the participation of the artists in the hospital was part of this development of a different relationship with madness and with suffering, where all this work in the psychiatrist hospital is being shown. And in a way, the art institution in itself is this institution where experimentation should be shown. and how the art institution can absorb this experiment in the 40s and 50s to rethink its own status and rethink its own public and its own process of exhibitions. And so how do you see this movement of showing this experiment that was an experiment that Tosquelles was inventing and proposing, and now that yourself and your colleague are trying to move that to the art space, to the art institution? What are the challenges? What are the difficulties of this move?
Well, you're just kind of pointing at one of the main problems of this project, because this is not a project specifically on art and culture. It is a project on psychiatry, becoming a place where avant-garde politics and avant-garde cultural production can come together. And I think this is a trend that we have not often seen in the 20th century's history. But Tosquelles carries with himself the experience of the years before the Spanish Civil War. And in those years, he was a militant of the anarchist movement in Spain, of the PUM, first of the Bloc Obrero Camperol, and then the PUM. And the idea that his politics were also from early on connected to the demands of the peasants' movements, the movement of Rabasaides, as we call it in Catalonia. It is very important because it is not just politics, it is the politics of the locality, of the particularity of the geography, of the demands. And at the same time, the fact that the cultural avant-garde was since early on imbricated with these kind of three lines of work. I mean, the avant-garde, the cultural, the political, and the psychiatric, reveals the fact that if they wanted to change things in the domain of psychiatry, they could not transform it just by applying medical measures or medical theories. They knew that in order to kind of improve the situation in psychiatric hospitals, they had to do it through politics, through real politics. Then the question of the cultural production within the hospital came because the ideas around ergotherapy were early on assimilated into the practices of the hospital. Tosquelles crossed the Franco-Spanish, the border at the end of the Spanish Civil War, carrying a book by Herman Simon, a book on the activation of mental patients. And it is a book that promoted the idea that patients should be doing things, should be activated physically and not just confined and controlled and mechanically restrained. So all these theories came together. And then in the early 40s in France, as I was trying to say before, the situation was really catastrophic. Patients were starving. So Tosquelles arrived at that hospital early in the 1914, January 40, and he very quickly realized that either they opened the doors of the hospital and let the inmates, let the patients go work on the fields and then come back with something to eat, or else they would all starve and die, as it did happen in many other hospitals in France, up to about 45,000 people, which is something terrible. I mean, it's called like the Holocaust of mad people. Then in those years, as you well suggested, Saint-Alban became a hideaway for intellectuals and writers like Paul Éluard, who took refuge there with his wife, Nouche. And the hospital became a place where cultural production was not only something represented by those coming from outside, but also by the activities the patients were leading. Tosquelles took with himself also the tradition of the associationist movement from Catalonia from before the Spanish Civil War, the kind of, the idea that since we don't have public services, we have to get all together, associate ourselves. And this is what is this being acknowledged as a sort of a cooperativist tradition. Tosquelles promoted the club within the hospital, and the club consisted basically in allowing the patients to self-organize, the self-organized activities on the level of the economy and through kind of open debates inside of the hospital. These granted a certain degree of autonomy. And among all those activities, there were not only artistic practices per se, but also cinema clubs, theater, celebrations of several festivities, excursions, the publication of a newspaper, an internal newspaper, and other newspapers that were able to also exit the hospital, be distributed outside of the hospital, so that the hospital itself becomes a counter-public sphere. What we have is a place in which the cultural production, it has a therapeutical value, but then the problem comes when we want to see this production outside of this kind of a therapeutical ensemble, this therapeutical milieu. And the example is Jean Dubuffet, who in 1945 went to the hospital and tried to extract, and I use the word extract, works by patients like Forestier, Marguerite Sylvains, Aimable Jaillet, or Benjamin Lachenval. His intention was to represent the production of those unaffected by culture. That is what Jean Dubuffet had in mind in those years by starting his collection of art brut, a label, a kind of term that it has nothing to do with whatever happened inside of the hospital. So here we have an interesting problem, and what Dubuffet is trying to carry out with his Compagnie de l'Art Brut, it's basically an ethnographic campaign, as his colleagues did with the Dakar Djibouti campaign in the 30s in Africa. Yet what Dubuffet was trying to do was to locate the work of mentally ill people in hospitals all over France and all over the world, because they sent really requests to many hospitals all over the world, including Brazil.
It's interesting that here in Brazil, we have a production, an artistic production in psychiatrist institutions that were spontaneous, like Bispo do Rosário, and also there was this production that was part of workshops that were conducted by psychiatrists and artists, like Hospital de Engenho de Dentro, da Anísio da Silveira, or with Osório César in São Paulo, that they, in a way, inspired the artists or provoked the artists to produce. And so with all these differences, what are the challenges to show this work in an exhibition? What are the responsibility of this curatorial project and of the viewer in an exhibition like this?
Totally agree, yeah. I think, Camilo, that, we're having a lot of debates about this because, what we know is that, for example, the label Art Brut is no longer attainable because this fixes these authors, these persons behind the work, which is described as Art Brut, in a sort of, an inferiority position, especially regarding categories of citizenship. Basically my idea is that when we are confronted with works of Art Brut, we know that behind this label, there is someone living in a hospital, thus someone who has not the same kind of citizenship that we as spectators enjoy. So the encounter with these works, for me, it's a stark representation of this uneven citizenship. On the one hand, us as spectators, enjoying this work aesthetically. On the other hand, these people who, by being secluded, by being institutionalized, they were deprived of their rights to citizenship, because this is what happens within institutions. I mean, they are deprived of their citizenship. We have alternative ideas, like, for example, of course, Lydia Clark's experiments. Those were experiments that went, I would say, from the hospital to the street and back to the hospital, and then back to the therapeutical society. So, of course, her position is a much more advanced position than that of the art brood or the art that came out straightforward from hospitals. I insist, I think that if this is an art that fascinates, that is so fascinating to us nowadays, it's because it really reveals different forms of citizenship that come together within the art world. But what we cannot ignore is that those working in hospitals, they were making those objects to subsist, to maybe integrate themselves in a more local economy. At least this was the case in Saint-Alban. In Saint-Alban, authors like Forestier, they were making their objects to be sold on a Sunday market in the village next to the hospital, just to get a bit of money and be able to buy himself a packet of cigarettes, and therefore thus get reintegrated into the normal economy from which this person was segregated.
Those people were actually making objects to survive somehow, and it is also a public sphere, this space. And what I'm thinking is that there are many ideas circulating. So getting all these people, these psychiatrists and these artists, and we had Fanon that you said, all of this working together in this space. So how this space may also be this transferring of ideas and processes and methods. So this is an important and political sphere of this work too, right? And I was thinking of how his relationship with politics before in Spain helped him to build and to gather all these people together in the hospital.
Definitely. I mean, as I said, I mean, they realized very early on that transformations in the field or with psychiatric institutions would not be possible if they were not thinking in political terms. So they already had all the medical ideas. In 1932, as I said, Tosquelles introduced Lacan's thesis in order to teach other doctors and personnel in the hospital of Reus, Perimeta. Tosquelles was aware of the ergotherapy promoted by Herman Simon since the end of the 20s, early 30s. So all the theories were there, but then there is a pragmatic side. And then in those years, there were situations that had to be responded with a more kind of active and proactive and absolutely pragmatic attitude, which is not to say that theories were not important, but I mean the practical reorganization of the hospitals that often included nurses and nuns and religious women who were working there all together with unexperienced guardians. The idea of transforming the guardians into a more technical personnel able to take care of the patients and not just watch them. So all these transformations were practical transformations within the different roles attributed to the people working within the premises of the hospital. So this is political when you redistribute the roles and the competences within a particular environment. But I would like to insist on the idea that the club, the idea of the club that promoted Tosquelles following his cooperativist experiences in before the Spanish Civil War in Catalonia, were absolutely central. The club allowed those patients to have their own economy, to decide on the activities they wanted to make, and as I said, to be autonomous within the premises of the hospital. And also the idea that they were not just making objects, because when we think of art within a hospital, we think of these ultra sort of traumatic aesthetics of objects that express the deep traumas. No. I mean, they were taking commands from outside the hospital to just, make objects, crafts. They were having a cine club. They were making theater. They were organizing trips. They were contracting a circus to perform within the hospital. So these organizational tasks by the patients and all these different degrees of cultural practices is something that vanishes completely behind the art brut object that is now exhibited in museums like Collection Art Brut in Lausanne or in other museums specialized with this particular label. So I think that we have to restitute this object. Our obligation is to restitute these objects, these so-called art objects, to the milieus, to the practices, to the more wide open social exchanges in which those objects were produced. So this is what art makes to any marginalized person. I mean, it fixes their identity as a marginal person, and it just selects few characters from these individuals.
It's a very naive question, but looking the images of Tosquelles, he's very performative. And I was wondering if this performativity of himself in the photographs was part of the performativity that he wanted to explore inside the psychiatrist hospital as a way of creating a different person. You need to perform something and create a different subjectivity. And so if you know a little bit about his behavior, and because he's very performative in the images all the time.
It's not naive at all, Camilo. It is a very good appreciation because whoever met Tosquelles, they remember his capacity to make everybody laugh, and his capacity to tell incredible stories. And from the films we have inherited from him, we know that he liked to describe complex therapeutical situations through very kind of specific anecdotes. So I think he's performative to begin with because his personality is not outside of that space of madness. His personality is also kind of plunging within the space of madness, within the social relationships generated by madness itself. Secondly, because, I mean, these kind of psychiatrists, they were working and living within the same premises, within the same space, so that this resembles very much the total institutions that Erving Goffman described, institutions that sort of took over completely the lives of the people living in there and making no distinction between work and life. He's very talkative, and he makes the others be talkative as well, because one of the main problems with madness, with neurosis, with traumatic situations is that language gets, the capacity to speak is blocked. So for Tosquelles, the idea of promoting the circulation of the word, promoting the circulation of the spoken word was very important. Therefore, he's kind of someone activating all these potentials, connections within the hospital. When you listen to him through different recordings, he's a great storyteller.
Thank you, Carles, and we keep in touch.
You're welcome.
Thank you. The exhibition now is certainly an opportunity for us to revisit and rethink the work that was made in the 20th century.
Great, thank you, Mariana.
And to know more information about the exhibition open now in Spain, visit our website, pipaprize.com. Thanks a lot for your participation in our season.